Welcome to Incentives Matter, your guide to what's new in behavioral science and behavioral economics. Let's see what's really driving decisions. A school-wide ban on mobile phones, something that sounds like a punitive measure, actually delivers academic gains equivalent to adding an extra week of schooling to the year. And the biggest beneficiaries aren't the top students, but those who are struggling the most.
It's a striking finding, especially considering the minimal cost of implementation compared to, say, reducing class sizes or hiring more tutors. The research suggests this isn't just a minor improvement, it's a significant boost to learning outcomes, particularly for students at the lower end of the academic spectrum.
So the policy is often framed as restrictive, yet it seems to be acting as a powerful, almost stealthy educational intervention. The title of this research really captures that tension: the Great Phone Ban Experiment, a nudge or a hammer. What are your initial thoughts on this?
It certainly feels more like a hammer from the student perspective, at least at first glance. But the outcomes, especially how they disproportionately benefit those who need it most, make it worth dissecting whether this hammer is actually forging better learning environments or perhaps acting as a very strong universal nudge by removing a persistent temptation.
This raises so many questions about the nature of distraction, self-control, and equity in education. What exactly did the researchers observe in terms of academic improvement, starting with the core data?
The studies, primarily out of the UK, looked at the impact of phone bans across various schools. What they found was quite consistent: a statistically significant improvement in test scores. To put it into perspective, the aggregate effect was about a 6.4% increase in a student's standard deviation in test scores. For the lowest achieving students, that figure jumped to 14.2%.
That 14.2% for low achievers really jumps out. Can you translate that into something more tangible? What does a 14% improvement in a standard deviation actually mean for a student? Think of it like this. It's roughly
Equivalent to gaining an additional hour of instruction per week, or the impact of reducing class size by a third. For students who are already struggling, this isn't just moving the needle, it's pushing them into a significantly higher percentile than they would have been otherwise. It suggests that for these students, the removal of phones eliminates a major barrier to learning.
So it's not just a marginal gain for everyone, but a targeted boost for those who often need the most support. This isn't about the top students getting even better, it's about closing an achievement gap.
Precisely. The research points to a crucial equity dimension. High-achieving students, who often possess stronger executive function skills and self-regulation, might be better equipped to manage the distraction of a phone, or perhaps they simply choose to engage with their phones less during class time. But for students with less developed self-control, or those already struggling with focus, the constant presence and potential notifications from a smartphone are a far greater impediment.
It's almost like a form of environmental control, removing the temptation entirely rather than expecting students to constantly exert willpower. And willpower, as behavioral science often reminds us, is a finite resource.
Exactly. Consider the attention residue concept. Even if a student doesn't actively use their phone during a lesson, merely having it nearby, buzzing or lighting up with notifications, can fragment their attention. Their mind might be anticipating a message, wondering what they're missing out on, or planning a response. That cognitive load detracts from their ability to fully engage with the material being taught. For students who are already finding academic content challenging, this additional cognitive burden can be the difference between understanding a concept and falling further behind.
So it's not just about the explicit act of checking Instagram, it's the insidious background hum of potential distraction that's doing the damage. It's the equivalent of trying to read a complex book while someone's constantly tapping your shoulder.
A very apt analogy. The brain is constantly running background processes, and if one of those processes is monitoring for phone activity, it's diverting resources away from learning. For a low-achieving student who might already be expending more mental effort to grasp the material, that diversion is far more costly. The ban creates a cleaner cognitive environment, allowing them to allocate their full attention to the lesson.
That makes a lot of sense. It suggests that the mechanism isn't necessarily about forcing students to do more work, but about removing a significant obstacle that was preventing them from doing the work effectively. But how are these bans actually implemented? Are schools just telling kids not to bring their phones, or are they confiscating them?
The implementation strategies vary, and the research highlights this. Some schools opt for a full ban, where students aren't allowed to bring phones onto school grounds at all. Others allow phones, but require them to be stored in lockers during the day. A more common and often more effective approach involves students depositing their phones in secure pouches or boxes at the start of the school day, retrieving them only when school is dismissed.
The pouch system, that sounds like a very direct removal of the device from the student's immediate environment. It's not just don't use it, it's you physically cannot access it.
That's right. And the research implies that the more comprehensive the ban, the greater the impact. A policy that simply says no phones in class is harder to enforce and leaves more room for students to circumvent the rule or for the phone to remain a latent distraction. When the phone is physically separated from the student, the temptation is largely removed.
What was the initial reaction from students and teachers? Because one might imagine a fair amount of pushback when such a policy is first introduced.
Absolutely. Initial resistance from students is a common theme. Concerns about safety, communication with parents, and simply a perceived loss of freedom are often voiced. However, the studies also report a fascinating shift over time. Teachers consistently report a more focused classroom environment, reduced disciplinary issues related to phone use, and increased student engagement. And perhaps surprisingly, a significant number of students, after experiencing a phone-free school day, report feeling less anxious, more present, and even relieved from the pressure to constantly check their devices.
So it's not just the academic benefits, but also potential improvements in social dynamics and mental well-being. It sounds like some students might actually be experiencing a kind of digital detox, even if it's involuntary.
That's an important angle, though the primary focus of this particular research was on academic outcomes. But anecdotally and in follow-up qualitative studies, these broader benefits certainly emerge. Students describe having more face-to-face interactions, feeling less pressure to compare themselves to others online, and simply being more attentive to their surroundings. It suggests the hammer might initially be unwelcome, but it ultimately fosters an environment where students can thrive in other ways too. And that leads to the question of cost effectiveness, which was mentioned earlier. The policy, compared to other educational interventions, must be incredibly cheap to implement. From a policy perspective, this is where phone bans become particularly compelling. Implementing a phone ban generally involves minimal financial outlay, perhaps some secure storage solutions or pouches. Compare that to the astronomical costs of hiring additional teachers to reduce class sizes or funding extensive tutoring programs, which often yield similar or even smaller academic gains. The return on investment for a phone ban appears remarkably high.
So, if a policymaker is looking for high-impact, low-cost interventions to improve educational outcomes, especially for disadvantaged students, this research seems to point a very clear finger.
It certainly does. The paper doesn't just present the findings, but also implicitly advocates for considering these bans as a serious and effective policy tool. It challenges the assumption that restricting phone access is simply a disciplinary measure. It reframes it as a powerful educational lever.
This brings the discussion back to the title, a nudge or a hammer. A nudge, in behavioral science, is typically defined as an intervention that steers people towards a choice without restricting their options. A hammer, on the other hand, is a direct restriction. Is a phone ban a nudge if it ultimately leads to better choices and outcomes, even if the initial mechanism is outright restriction?
That's a fascinating philosophical and practical question. From a strict definition, a ban is not a nudge. It's a mandate. It removes the choice. A classic nudge would be, say, changing the default setting on a phone to do not disturb during school hours, but allowing the student to opt out. However, if one looks at the effect and the reported positive shifts in student behavior and well-being, it could be argued that the hammer of the ban creates an environment where students are naturally inclined towards better learning behaviors without constantly fighting internal battles of self-control.
So the ban acts as a kind of meta-nudge, creating a nudge-friendly environment where positive behaviors become the default by removing the most potent distractors. It's like removing all the junk food from the pantry so you naturally eat healthier without having to constantly resist temptation.
That's a good good way to frame it. The immediate action is restrictive, but the long-term impact cultivates a more conducive environment for choices aligned with academic success and improved focus. It's not about subtly shifting preferences, it's about fundamentally altering the choice architecture of the school day.
And the equity angle really underscores this. For students who might not have the same level of self-control or support systems, this environmental restructuring is a far more impactful intervention than merely being told, don't use your phone.
Exactly. It levels the playing field to some extent by removing a pervasive source of inequality in attention and focus. The ability to resist phone temptation isn't evenly distributed, and this policy implicitly acknowledges that by removing the source of temptation for everyone.
So, if one were to distill this down to a few key insights for listeners, what would be the most important takeaways from this research on phone bans?
First, school-wide phone bans demonstrate a substantial, measurable improvement in academic performance, particularly for students who are already struggling. This highlights a clear equity benefit.
And second, the cost effectiveness is remarkable. Compared to other educational interventions, phone bans deliver significant gains with very little financial outlay, making them an attractive policy option.
Third, the mechanism appears to be primarily the reduction of cognitive load and attention residue, allowing students to focus more completely on learning rather than constantly battling internal and external distractions from their devices.
And finally, while initially seen as restrictive, these bans can lead to broader positive outcomes beyond test scores, including improved classroom environment, reduced anxiety, and more face-to-face social interaction among students.
This research highlights the true cost of constant connectivity, not just in terms of academic performance, but also on the fabric of social interaction and individual well-being during formative years.
This research certainly provides a compelling argument for reassessing the role of phones in schools. It challenges the idea that restricting technology is inherently regressive, suggesting it can actually be a progressive step towards better educational outcomes and more equitable learning environments.
It prompts the question, if such a simple, low-cost intervention can yield these results, what other subtle but pervasive distractions are hindering learning and development, and how might such distractions be addressed?
And perhaps, what is the optimal balance between equipping students with technological literacy and protecting their attention spans during critical learning periods? That's all for this episode of Incentives Matter. Join us next time as we keep unpacking what really drives decisions. Thanks for listening.
Choose wisely, or at least know why you didn't.